Okay, let's see. The date is October 13th. This is Collin College at ITSE 2309. This is the normal Friday meeting. Let's see. Last meeting, we did not have a recording because we had a test. I am in the process of grading the tests. I just have tests this week in all my classes, so I'm kind of swamped. But I will try to have those back to you and commented. So I'm making a copy of them and writing my comments into each of the tests. And I'll have more. I'll give some feedback on the test. But right now, I've gotten them all downloaded and organized, and I'm going through them as fast as I can get through them. But I will get through them quickly. I do believe in returning stuff quickly. We today are in Module 7. Module 7 is a fairly short module, so we shouldn't take all morning anyway on it. And it talks about data aggregation is the title. Data aggregation is essentially working with groups of data. So I want to know the average. I want to know the how many I have. I want to know the sum, the minimum, or the maximum, and those 5 will be the ones we will deal with. What is the largest? What is the smallest? What is the average? What is the sum? And what is the count? There are others. Our textbook deals only with those 5. There are full statistical stuff. There is standard deviations and variances and mean, median, mode. All that's the statistical stuff that you would expect. However, this isn't a class in statistics. Student resources. Okay, I don't need to see me, so I'm going to hide the thumbnail. PowerPoint, you have the chapter 5. It's chapter 5 in the textbook, module 7. I guess I should have made them agree. But the slides, for some reason, I have 2 links. They both go to the same set of slides. I'm going to use the PowerPoints today, but I'm not going to try to go through each and every little PowerPoint. Okay. So I'll motivate by these. Chapter 5, how to code summary queries. It gives us a good set of objectives. These are the ones that we are going to be working with: average, sum, the minimum, the maximum, the count, count all, count distinct, and count star. And we'll talk about each one of those. The difference between average of all and average of distinct would be it only averages, takes an average of one of them. If there are duplicates, it only counts them as one. So if I say to take the average of 2, 3, and 4, well, the average would be 3. If I say take the average distinct of 2, 3, 4, 4, the average would still be 3 because I would only average one of the 4s because I said distinct. You don't use that very often. Most of the time you say, you mean all. All is the default, by the way. So you don't have to say at AVG all if that's what you want. And that will usually be, I don't know of any in the exercise set that asks for a distinct. But if I say average distinct and it has duplicate numbers in it, those duplicate numbers are just counted one time for the average. Same thing for the sum, minimum, maximum, count. The count only counts where that field is not null. Okay. If you ask for a count of all of the invoice names, for example, and one of the names is null, that name will not give you a count. If you want to count just the records, I want to count, and I don't care whether what they have in them, I'm going to count the record. If a record's there, count it. You're going to say count star, count the asterisk, and that is faster than saying count the primary key. Since I know that every record has to have a primary key, has to have a unique primary key, if I say count the primary key, I'm going to get the same thing as the number of records. It is better to say count star, because that will actually cause your SQL query to run faster, because now it doesn't have to go in and look at them. It's a little bit like I say, count the people. And so I say, okay, how many people do I have in here? 1, 2, 3, 4, so and so on. If I say to count your noses, let's say 1, 2, excuse me, Matthew, I can't see your nose. There, I see it, a nose. I know he has to have a nose. So all I have to do is see a person's there, and I count it. If you say count the primary key, then it has to go in and make sure that the primary key isn't null, but it can't be. So if you just want the count of the records, you're going to use count star, the last one here. Enough of that. Okay. This is an example of a query that uses count. If I say select count star, and in good practice, I will say as something. Okay, I am now on slide number 4. Select count star as number of invoices, the sum of that statement, the invoice total minus payment total, credit code total, as from invoices where, okay, notice that I get one line. Okay, sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes you want one line. So if you just say count something, you'll get one line. The count of all of them. Questions so far? Okay, let's move on, because this is fairly simple piece of it. I could have asked for the average. I could have asked for the minimum, the maximum in there also, and I would have gotten all of that. It would have been maybe a little more confusing. Let's see. Here is one select in the quote after 9/1/2011, let you know when this data set was written. And that is a constant. It's always going to say after 9/1/2011 as the day, count star. So I've added something to it, something that gives me information about it. I don't usually do that. And I guess at this point, when we get into this chapter, I want to say something about an SQL query. The output of an SQL query was never really designed to be sent to the end user directly. The output of an SQL query usually feeds a web page, so it is usually processed further. So I'm not too worried about putting something on there like after 9/1/2011. I can do that at a higher level. I'll do that in the web page. Same thing with naming the fields with long-winded names. I'm perfectly happy to name that field X. I just want to give it a name so that it displays a name and I can talk about it later in the query. I don't care if you write it out as number of invoices. That's kind of irrelevant in a query. We're going to talk more about that later as we go on, because some of these queries in this chapter get a little complicated, and I'm going to talk about just what I want you to know about it. Going down. Min and max, minimum, maximum. You guys know how that works. I don't have to tell you what a minimum, maximum. Finds the minimum highest invoice total and the lowest invoice total. Okay. The minimum vendor name. I don't know why I would want to know the minimum vendor name, but if I did, it would give me the first one in the alphabet. Okay, count distinct vendor ID. from invoices. How many different vendor IDs do I have in the invoices? Now, the vendor ID is not necessarily going to be unique. There may be others in invoices. Now, if I were in the vendors table, that's kind of silly because they have to be distinct. But in the invoices table, there can be duplicates. So I know that out of 114 invoices, since I'm counting the they're doing something here that I don't like. They want to get the number of invoices, so they're saying count the vendor IDs. What should they have done there instead of counting the vendor IDs, where they just want to know the number of invoices they have? Well, they could have counted the invoice number, I agree, but what makes it run faster? Count star. Just count the rows. Okay. And that would have been better in this one. Now, the count distinct vendor ID, that has to be the vendor ID. But the other one, all they're trying to get is a count of how many invoices they have. And we see here that there are 114 invoices with 34 different vendors. Rolling on. Might come back to this one. Okay, here's where the rubber meets the road. Now, this is the one that gives students trouble, and there is no particular reason, and I'm losing my mic here, there is no particular reason for students to have trouble with this. Let's take a look at it. What's different about this one, this query, that wasn't true about the others? Notice that the results set is returning, has in it multiple rows. I don't know exactly how many. Is it 8? Might be 8. I don't know. What is different about this query that wasn't true about the others? Now, this one gives you back multiple rows. Notice the select line. Okay. Well, you look at that select line. Look at this one. Look at the first field right there. Now, let's roll backwards. What does the other one have in it that this one did not have in the select line? Okay. The count is there. Now notice everything in that select line is an aggregate function. Everything in the select line is one of those guys. Count, sum, min, max, average. Count, sum, min, max, average. That's 5. Okay. One of they're all aggregated. There's nothing in there that isn't an aggregate. All right, let's roll down to this one. This one has introduced something different. This one has, I guess I should stay here and point with the mouse. I keep wanting to get up and point at the screen. Notice that this one has in it the vendor ID. The vendor ID is not an aggregate function. I want to see the vendor ID. Well, if I say average, do I want all of the average? Do I want to see the average reproduced a bunch of times? Now, some databases will do that, but most of them anymore won't. They don't know what you want to see, what you want to see averaged. So if I were just to run the query without having the group by is where I'm going with this, notice that we picked up another one right after from invoices, we've picked up a group by. Okay. If you have a field on the select line that is not in a group by function, in an aggregate function, one of those 5, and you have an aggregate function. So I've got, when this rule kicks in, I have two or more fields. I'm selecting two or more fields. One or more of these fields is an aggregate: sum, count, min, max, average. And one or more is not an aggregate. Okay, this one has two. One of them, vendor ID, is not aggregated. And I have an aggregate. This rule kicks in. Here's the rule. When we're in that situation, everything that is not in an aggregate function must be grouped. That's as clear as I can make it. No exceptions. Now, what this does, when I add this line, group by vendor ID. Okay, vendor ID is on the select line, therefore vendor ID must be in the group by. I don't know, some databases do exist, Access for one, that will automatically group them. Okay, most of the time they don't. So therefore you have to put it in. What this does is every place that there are duplicate vendor IDs will collapse into one row. And the aggregate function, whatever one of those five you want to use, one of the five that we're looking at, that you want to use applies to that group. So if I say, show me a count of attendance, and I have student and date, class and date, something like that. So I have class name, class number, course number, date, and I want to count the attendance, count the students that I have. I would have to group by class number, comma, date. I have two fields there that aren't aggregated. So I would see a count by class number, by date. If I say group, if I want to select the city, we're going to select city and state here. And then some aggregate functions by city and by state. When I say group by city, state, all of the records that are from San Diego, California will collapse into one row in the output. All of the records from San Diego, Texas, there is one, will collapse into one row in the output. Questions? It's pretty simple, but this gives students lots of trouble for some reason. Okay. Questions, please. I'm going to turn on my chats. I guess. Am I in chat? I guess I've got the chat on. Have to send that to somebody. No. Okay, next one. The difference between having and where. Okay. Well, up until now, we have been saying select from where. The where applies to an individual field or fields. You can have ands and ors in there. You can have, it usually involves a greater than, less than, equal to, or their opposites. And it can have and or all in there. Excuse me. We've been doing that for, what, several weeks now. And we've seen that. Now, having applies to an aggregate. So think of having as a where clause that is applied to an aggregate. So having average of invoice total greater than 2,000. I always put group by and having together, I either put them on the same line or I indent under them, because the having applies to the group by. You can't have a having clause, if that makes it have a having. If you have a group by, then you may have the having clause. If you don't have a group by, you can't have it. It comes right after the group by. So whenever I type it, I always either put it on the same line, group by something, and then space having, or if that line gets too long and unwieldy, I will do a line feed and tab it over under it to show that those two are together. So having applies to the group, where applies to an individual row. Fair enough? And then order by. Notice that the order by can apply to the column alias. And so, by vendor ID, now notice I'm selecting from invoices. I did not join the table. Here would be an interesting question. What would I get if I joined the tables and selected vendor ID from the vendors table? The average invoice total would be null. The invoice total would be null in many of them. So I believe I would get an error message there because I can't take the average of nothing. But if they're in the invoices table, they have an invoice. And it has something. So I can take the average of 0. Well, my test grades are 0, 0, 0, and 0. What's my average? 0. That's easy. What is my average if I don't have any test grades? That's an error because I can't divide by 0. Okay. All right. What's the rule? If I have an aggregate function, at least one, and at least one non-aggregate function, just a plain old field from the table, then I must have all of those non-aggregate fields grouped by. If I have 2 of them, I have to say group by vendor city, comma, vendor state. That's perfectly legal, but I cannot have a field in the select clause that does not appear in the group by clause. So vendor ID, vendor 110 has an average amount of $23,978.48. When you see money, money by default will have, I believe it will have 4 decimal places by default. Yes, here, vendor ID 122, for example, is showing 4 decimal places on the money. We're going to talk more about that. Money is calculated to 4 decimal places. Down. So it counts the number of invoices by vendor. Very straightforward query. We have a vendor ID where we have an aggregate function. We must have the vendor ID in the group by. The having clause is optional. Don't have to have that. It must appear in the group by. If I only wanted to see the vendor IDs where the count was greater than 1, that would go in the having clause, where having having invoice quantity greater than 1. One other thing let's see, having average invoice total. Okay. Look like this. Having that is the way I would write it. Now, if I were to run that query, I would see. I would only see the query. I'm not in my SQL now. It's not going to run it correctly if I'm in PowerPoint. But having count greater than 1, I should only see line 1, vendor ID 34, 37. I would not see vendor ID 48. This next one, I'm on slide number 12 now. Slide number 12 has 2 fields that are not aggregated and at least 1 aggregate field. Therefore, both of those non-aggregated fields have to appear in the group by clause. The order that they appear in the group by clause matters. Group by, well, it won't change the fields that you get output. If you say group by those 2, it's going to put all of San Diego, Texas in one row and all of San Diego, California in another row. If you change them, it would not change the rows that you output. Okay. So the order of the group by doesn't matter. Or order you write the order by in matters. So we should be on the group by row. I should be able to say vendor city, comma, vendor state, and then order by vendor state, comma, vendor city. In other words, sort the states first, then the cities. If you have an order by on them, it shouldn't matter what order you group. So I misspoke there. I'm sorry. The group by order doesn't matter. Same one with a having clause. I would have indented the having row, and I'm now on slide 13. I would have indented that having row. I think it makes your query look readable because group by and having are, in my opinion, the same row. They must come right together. So I usually put them either on the same line or indent under it. Questions on query 13. I'm going to keep moving. Here we have a join. Let's see, what is this? Select the vendor name. So I have something on this guy. I have vendor name. It is not aggregated. And I have something that is aggregated. The rest of them, doesn't matter how many I have. So I'm going to put, I know that our textbook here is just saying join. What do I want you to do instead of just say join? Enter join, please. Okay. For the purposes of this class. It'll be right in any platform if you just say join, but I don't know. I've always taught it as write out enter join, humor me. Enter join invoices on. I would have aliased the vendors as from vendors as the enter join invoices as because I hate to type. I've always believed, I always say I believe that a computer programmer should be a slow typist and should think about what you're typing and format it as you go. Then this one would look like v.vendor ID, i.vendor ID, and equal. I write it group by vendor name, has to be, this one must be having, would get tabbed, whoops, boy did that get tabbed over. I would indent the having clause under it, having the average of invoice total of greater than 500. I do not have to select the average invoice total in the select line to use it in the having line, very much like a where that applies to the groups. And finally, order by invoice quantity, which is the alias. Question on slide 14. The difference between the having, okay, let's go back here, having average invoice total greater than 500. I've gone back to slide 14 for a minute. It's got a having clause. Now, when we jump ahead, one more ahead to slide 15, this one has to have a group by, because it's triggered our rule. In the select line tells me I have to have the group by. So in the select line, I've got a vendor name, must be grouped by vendor name. But notice there's no having. This one has a where clause, where invoice total is greater than 500. What will be the difference between those two queries? Let's look at these two side by side. Take this one out, copy. Let's see. This one has the where. I'm going to go back and get the one from this one uses the having. Let's see, I'll put them here in order. Let's take a look at these guys. What is the difference? Notice that the select line is the same. The from line was the same before I changed the first one to use the full syntax. So the from line is logically the same. The group by is, the first one says group by vendor name having invoice total greater than 500. The second one on line 14, it says where the invoice total is greater than 500. How will these be different? Agreed, the invoice average will be different. The first one that uses the having will average all of the invoices, but it will only show you the ones where the average is greater than 500. The second one will only average invoice totals greater than 500, but it will show you everything that it averaged. So I'm assuming that the invoice total would be greater than 500. Well, it would show me the count of them that had greater than 500 in that record. So the where applies to each individual row, having applies to the groups. Are we fair enough on that? pause for a minute. Maybe I should turn on my Canvas messaging. Let's see, that's probably a bad idea. Somebody might have, I'd be showing private stuff over the internet. Possibly private. Questions? Okay. So this one on the, where we did the halving, we see total of 19 rows. When we go to where, I get more rows, but different numbers. Like the where, the halving can have compound conditions. Slide 16 shows a halving clause that has ands and ors all through it. That's fine. Think of it as just like a where, but it applies to the groups instead of the individual rows. And an or works, greater than, less than, between works, order by. I'm going to move on. Nothing new in slide 16. Where clause, again, this is a completely different thing. It says the same summary query. I disagree that this is the same summary query. I disagree that this is going to give me the same output. Invoice date 1/31/2012. Okay, I guess this one will, just because it's going to group the, we're grouping by invoice date. So the invoice date is going to be consistent across. So in this particular case, the where and the having give us the same output. That's not generally the case, though. Moving something to the where clause does not generally give you the same query. This particular one on slides 16 and 17 does happen to give us the same summary query, the same result set. Okay. We're going to start something completely different now. I'm going to pause for a minute. Do I still have audio? Matthew? Am I still audio? Okay. Questions? Again, what's the rule? That's what I want you to get out of this today. If I have both aggregate function and a field that is not an aggregate function. Now, we saw it a minute ago. They said select, quote, some label that they wanted to put on it. That's okay. That's not a field. It selects a field from the table, and it has an aggregate function in it. Then the field, all of the fields that you select from the table must be grouped by. That will usually be one or two. As you get too many of them, it can get pretty complicated. And I'm about to show some more complicated stuff. That's kind of logically where I end with this topic. Now, I'm going to go on. Because our textbook does some stuff that is not standard SQL, but it is included in so many of them that it's time to start talking about it now. There's some of these clauses with rollup, for example. With rollup is not typically included in SQL, and there is a reason why purists don't like it. Now, let's look at the output of that summary query, this roll-up query. I believe I have this one up in my SQL. So I'll put this file out there for you. I'll save this to your student resources. You will have this file. Is that the one that I'm using now? Account invoice total. No, that's not the one I've got. So I'm going to wait on that using the SQL server for a minute. Select vendor ID, count star as vendor count, select the sum from invoices, group by vendor ID with roll up. G, what does roll up mean to you? Roll up. At the end of the day, the roll up of okay, we're going to total everything, and I'm going to give you a roll up line. Okay, roll it up, summarize everything, and give it to you like that. Now look at the output of this query that they give you, and notice that there are, select the vendor ID, so we have, let's see, I don't know how many, oh yes, we have 34 rows, and I can tell that there's 34 rows here because I can see the last line number is 34. So it gives me 34 rows. And the count is one, it counts like this. Now the last row, notice the last row gives me a null vendor ID. But I selected from invoices. I can't have a null vendor ID in invoices. But the last row is not the same as the rest of them. Do you see that? Now, this is my problem. I always think of the output of an SQL query as being a set of rows that all conform to the where clause. In this case, there isn't a where clause. So I'm expecting all of the rows that it returns to be the same. But when you put with rollup on it, it gives you one row at the end that really doesn't belong there. That's some summary totals. So what does it do? It adds them all up in this case. Now, I'm not sure what it would do if you rolled up something that didn't add up as a number. But I think it has to. I think roll up means add up total all of those columns. Okay. Questions? I typically do not. I don't believe I included any exercises that had roll up in it. I'm mainly asking you guys to get the group by straight. So the group by and the having. I don't think I did anything with roll up. Roll up says tack an extra line on the end. Let me go on. Let me find. Okay, I'm going to go back here. Okay. And here is a query that is up. I'll make this file available to you. Select vendor state, vendor city, and count splat, we always say. I don't want to say star, I say count splat. Splat. From vendors, where vendor state is in Iowa and New Jersey. Okay, so I'm only interested in Iowa and New Jersey here for some reason. I have to group by vendor state, vendor city with roll up. Order by vendor state descending, vendor city descending. Okay. And so, what do I get here? Okay, so when I say group by both fields, when I just had one field in there, it wasn't too confusing, but what am I getting here? Is this output? Select vendor state, New Jersey. So vendor state, New Jersey, I have a count of 4, total of 4 from New Jersey. I have a total of 2 from the state of Iowa. I have a total of 2 from a city named Washington. Therefore, I must have a Washington in Iowa and another one in New Jersey. Same thing with Fairfield. That is a little bit difficult for me to see. Let me run that. I just want to see it. I'm just going to run it without the, I'm going to take out the count, and I'm just going to select vendor state, vendor city from vendors that are in that. I want to see what the output set is. I'm going to execute that. And it tells me I have a Washington, New Jersey, a Washington, Iowa, Fairfield, New Jersey, and East Brunswick, New Jersey, Fairfield, Iowa. So I have 6 rows. Okay. I agree with the output. Executing. See if I can blow that up. It's not blowing up any. Oh, okay. I must have. I didn't. I must have had something else highlighted. Okay, let's look at this output since this matches what's in the book. And let me find this slide. Okay, this one comes from slide number 19. So I'm referring to slide 19. I've skipped over a couple of them, and that's okay. What I have up here is slide 19. And when I run this, I see, again, I'm going to point with the mouse. I see that I have one vendor in Washington, New Jersey. I have one vendor in Fairfield, New Jersey, 2 vendors in East Brunswick, New Jersey, for a New Jersey total of 4. You with me? I have one vendor in Washington, Iowa, one vendor in Fairfield, Iowa. Apparently, I have no vendors from East Brunswick, Iowa. Maybe I don't have an East Brunswick. Giving me a total of 2 vendors for Iowa. And line 8 gives me a total of 6 vendors overall. Now, isn't that obvious? I don't think so. You're shaking your head. Oh, yeah, it's obvious. Just because I say it's obvious, does that make it obvious? No, it's not obvious at all to me. if I didn't know what that query was doing, it takes me a while to look at that. This is why I don't like roll-up, because I have a total of 8 rows up there. 3 of them give me some information about New Jersey, 2 more, so a total of 5 rows are giving me the output of the query. 2 rows are summing it by state, and then the last row is summing everything. I do not find that to be very useful. How would I do it if I wanted that information? Now, here, this is a little bit different. I'm going to take a different approach. I would write this way. The first query is going to give me the 5 rows that I wanted. Okay, so here are the 5 rows that this is vendor state and the count from vendors, where it's in Iowa and New Jersey, grouped by, of course. When I run this, that's easier for me to understand. They're all the same thing. Are you with me? Donna, have I lost everybody yet? Okay, they're all the same. Now, this one, I can send this to the web page. You do as you please with it, because you're getting all the rows are the same. Now, I want some more information. Give me more, tell me more, tell me more. This one, I'm going to give it to you by the state. So this is going to give you the counts by the state. When I execute this, this tells you that in Iowa, you've got 2, and New Jersey, you got 4. If you want to see what they are, go back to the other query. Now, when you're displaying these data, I can use both of these queries. And the first one gives you one set of data. The second one gives you something different information that you're using. That makes sense? Last but not least, let's total it all together. I want to know the total. Okay, there's your total. 6. Okay. Now, if I wanted to put them together, this is what that roll-up does. Let's look at it. I can put them together. I'm not going to ask you to do this. I take my, let me see if I can pull this down. I take my first query. There he is. If I run this, it's going to give me 6 rows. Now, I have to take the order by out of it. We discussed union, right? We're going to, union really comes in chapter 5. But union says that I put together the output of multiple queries. What do they have to have? They have to have the same number and compatible types of columns. Same number of columns. I cannot order by one query in a union. So I have to get that order by out. Line 37 on here, I've taken out the order by, because I cannot order by and have a union. If I order by, I have to order by the whole union. I can't just order by this one query and then take a union. Now, the next one is the one that counts them, by state. But it has to have the same number of columns. Okay. There's no city, so I'm going to put a null in here to make that query have the same number of columns. It'll accept the union. Null cannot be incompatible. Null is nothing. Okay, put nothing here. Last but not least, I just want the count of everything, so I put 2 nulls. And here is the place that I like to say order by 1 comma 2. What am I talking? I haven't talked about that very much because I don't like talking about order by 1, order by 2. But in this case, it works well because the order by applies to the union. So I have indented it slightly to show you it applies to everything. Order by the first field, then by the second field. When I run this query, again, I see 8 rows. Again, I have all of them. They don't come out in quite the same order, but from this, the 2 that are null, null and null, tell me that I have a total of 6 vendors. I have 1 in Washington, Iowa, 1 in Fairfield, Iowa, and for Iowa in general, I have 2. I have 1 in Washington, New Jersey, 1 in Fairfield, New Jersey, 2 in East Brunswick, New Jersey, for a total of 4. Now, that is essentially what the roll up on 2 columns does. I would have left it in 3 separate queries. And that is what I would have used all 3 of those queries to feed the web page. One of the windows on the web page would be showing output from the first query. Then right under it, I would have some explanatory information. I would show them the output from the second query. And then I would have one last little window there that says, and the grand total is. And then I would show them the output from the third query. Instead of putting together output that has rows that semantically are different. Questions? All right, I'm going to keep going here. I typically do not put roll up on a test. If I accidentally gave you an exercise with roll up, just live with it. Cube. What is cube? How is cube different? Cube is another one. Let me see if I can. I've got it right here. I've done it in SQL, and I had done what I was somebody with cube. Select this guy. Count sum from invoices. So this is the query. So this is the query that is coming from slide number 20. Let me label it. I would write this as, I believe, 2 of them. My first one is going to give me the counts and sums by vendor ID. So if I were to run this one, I would see 34 rows of the invoice totals and the invoice counts. I'm trying to come up with a good explanation of the difference between roll-up and cube. But I would do it in 2 separate queries, and then the first one is just going to give you the 34 rows. Notice that when I ran the one from the slides, so this one came from slide 20, I get 35 rows with a null vendor ID and some totals. This one, if I run this one, I just get the first 34 rows with no total, no totals at the end. Now I have another query that just gives me the totals and the counts. If I put them together, I have the number. Now notice that I have a different number of columns. So when I put them together in a union, I have to add a null in there. But I'm typically not going to put them together in a union. I don't want to confuse my users. I don't want to hand you a table of data where I've got rows, 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 and then all of a sudden the summary row and no way to tell the difference. Now, I guess instead of selecting null, I could have said summary row in there, would have worked. So I could have done something like this. I think that might work. I don't know. Let's find out. Nope, can't. Union won't work. Have to do null. Null is nice because it's compatible with everything. So I guess I could tell you that when you see execute, this is the same query. When you see that last one with a null on it, that row means something different. It's not important to say as on the if you're doing a union or you do union more than intersect, but only on the first one do you need an as on the first query in the union, because it's going to carry that column name down. So it doesn't matter in the union. Notice on one of the unions up above there, as I have as invoice count there. Now, when I do it with a union, okay, I have it as invoice count there. I think one of these I didn't. Yeah, right here. Line 44. On that second select, when I just did that, okay, I should have had one there because there's no column name. Notice when I did it here, I gave it a name because this query stands alone. Once I union them, this name is going to carry down. So it doesn't matter. If I can put as anything and it won't show in the final output. It's just ignored. I was afraid somebody was going to ask me that question, and I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. I believe it looks to me like they're doing the same thing. It's a summary. There's your homework. Research that and tell me what the difference between rollup and cube is. Other thing that that I'm curious about, I have never seen rollup and cube used with Oracle as a platform. I'm curious if they work on Oracle. They are non-standard, not non-SQL standard. Let's see. Anybody need to take a break? I'm going to go to I'm going to take a break now. I don't have a whole lot. Let's tell you what. Let me just finish up. I don't have a whole lot more to go. Then we'll take a nice long break. With cube as a final summary row. I guess the difference is with cube as a final summary row. It probably tells us in the book. I don't use them very much. I would give you the information in the table, and then I would give you another query that gave you the summary information. I would separate them. I think it's better. Um, if you want to get really confused, you can look at slide 21. Like I say, I am not going to make this a big point. With roll up and cube are not big on my agenda. I want you to understand about when you do aggregate functions, group by, and halving. And take a look at cube. Okay, grouping sets. Um, select vendor state, vendor city, count as something from vendors where it's Iowa and New Jersey. Again, group by vendor state, vendor city, but this one has included the word grouping sets. Uh, if I wanted really to confuse my reader, I would use grouping sets. That might be a reason to have them this way. So I have, we're going to group by New Jersey first, Iowa first. This tells me I have 4 in New Jersey, 2 in Iowa. Now something for something completely different. We have 2 of them in a city called Washington, 2 of them in a city called Fairfield, 2 of them in a city called East Brunswick. I don't know. I just wouldn't do this to anybody. Um, that's not obvious to me until I really sit down and look at it, that this is what it's showing me. And it's kind of like with a database and using these roll-ups and grouping sets, it's quite possible to just give you incomprehensible data. And the objective is to try to make it easy to read. Therefore, since I'm probably going to be displaying this to my end user in a report form or in a, I have within this, I have wonderful tools for creating reports, wonderful tools for creating web pages and forms. I'm going to use those tools to display it, and I'm going to separate these grouping sets into 2 queries. How would I display these data right here in 2 queries? Very well. I would do the vendor state first, select vendor state, count star, from vendors group by vendor state. Second query, vendor city, select vendor city. So you would have 2 queries. First one would give you 2 rows. Second one will give you 3. Questions? Like I say, I'm only covering this because it's here. Let's go on with this. If I really wanted to confuse everybody, I would go through this one. I consider slide 23 incomprehensible. Oh no. You can take a look at these and the over. I think that's all of that I'm going to do. Questions? Okay. What did I give you to do on the exercises for chapter 5? I believe all of my exercises. I have taken out anything that has to do with roll up. I have taken out anything that has to do with cube. If I accidentally left something in there, just put in with roll up and try to interpret it. I believe I've taken everything out. Okay, so we're going to take a break now. I'm going to move on into the next module a little ways. So don't do a fire drill. I'll probably go on another 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to introduce chapter 6. Chapter 6 is a very important chapter. So I'm going to be ending lecture on chapter 5. We will come back here in a moment.